Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Man vs. Mob. This one is about the hidden patterns of history, not in a conspiracy way, but it's a topic that I'm really interested in and one that I think provides a lot of meaning and context that is really needed. I think it's a super unfortunate thing that history generally isn't taught very well in public school, and it results in people assuming history is just an endless sequence of names and dates that you have to memorize, and it causes people to really resent history and turn away from it. And history is needed to understand us, to understand you, to understand me. It is the study of us. And it reminds me of how a lot of people say that they hate mathematics and they avoid it at all costs. The way that math is taught is also terrible, in that it's basically just an endless experiment in different problems, and you're not really taught the general ideas so that you can recognize the different situations. It's just endless math problems. So history is the same in that regard, in that it's poorly taught but super important. So okay, where to begin? I'm going to try to break it down as quickly as I can, but in about 5 or 6 different ways of viewing history. So the first that I'm going to go into is paradigms. The second is narratives, then ego blows, then generations or saeculums, and finally supercycles and alliances. So when it comes to paradigms, the four primary paradigms of human history are: first, we were hunter gatherers, then, we were agriculturalists, then, we were industrialists, and now we are technologists. So, at the very beginning, when cavemen were roaming around, human beings were hunters and gatherers, and basically met their basic needs by roaming around and finding them scattered about. And the primary meaning that people got from their lives was in small tribal communities. They got it through the sense of community, the sense of family, belief in something greater than themselves, which at that point was pretty much like spirits and natural phenomena, and vocation. So that was generally like hunting or gathering, or maybe primitive trade of some kind. I don't know, tool making. And there was eventually a shift into agriculture, and that required human beings to basically start to settle in larger societies and stay in one place to maintain the land and to weed the land and till it and do all these things that were extremely labor intensive. So there was a lot of toil to the agricultural era. And there was, as I mentioned, there was more centralization, and people were still able basically to get their fulfillment met. There were still families and communities, but the communities might have been more spread out. But people had to focus more on the idea of protection and in fear from raids, and protecting their property and demarcating the property lines and things like that. So really, the idea of property came into its own in the agricultural paradigm. And then only about 200 years ago, the industrial paradigm started. And when you think industry, you generally think about factories and gears, steam engines, and time clocks, and rapid transportation like railways, riverboats, labor. All these things come to mind. So, of course, cities, immigrants, and this was the point in human history where people started to urbanize, started to move more to the cities and mix together more. And there was a sense of atomization that came with that, a sense of intense disruption and being isolated from family and community and meaningful vocation, because there was more of an emphasis on standardized parts and assembly line and people fulfilling a basic, simple role rather than sort of people fulfilling a multifaceted role where they had to have different skills and abilities and be more adaptable. Now it was, okay, uh, people are just a small part of one bigger system, and we took on mass education, standardized education, and we started to regard human beings basically as standardized parts, just like we were viewing uh, the pieces of an industrial product as standardized. So it was a really pretty gross view of humans as something that you should manipulate and get to conform. And it ignored humans' individual needs, and it ignored what allowed them to get a sense of meaning and purpose in life. And this was at a time where they were at their most vulnerable too. So um, that's really where we've been for the last 200 years. And in the United States in particular, the shift from the agricultural paradigm to the industrial paradigm resulted in the Civil War, where you had the North that was industrializing and the South that was agricultural based. And the North was saying to the South, um, your system of agriculture and slavery is out of date and immoral. And the South was looking at this and saying, well, first of all, and obviously there was plenty of racial animosity mixed into this as well, and a sense that they were being looked down upon from Northerners, like a sense of um, Northern arrogance mixed with obviously Southern ignorance as well, and Northern ignorance and Southern arrogance. And there was this view of, okay, well, you're relying, even though we have slavery, you're relying indirectly on our slavery because you're using our agricultural products as well as other people around the world using our agricultural products. So there was resentment about that. There was also the idea of rebellion and sort of sticking it to the people that are telling you what to do. And then so sort of a defiance mentality. And then there was also on top of that a um, a realization that the South had a lot of its resources and money and capital invested in the systems of agriculture that existed. So to just uproot and do away with them was much more difficult for the South than for the North, which wasn't reliant on them as directly. So there's a lot more depth to what was going on than most people really understand. And that's why I think history is fascinating, is because there are all these things happening at once, and you can look at any given thread, so, or any given experience. Um, so now we're at a point where we're shifting from the industrial paradigm to the technological paradigm, and there's a real opportunity here to see where we went wrong, to see where we diverged from the path of human betterment and human empowerment in the industrial paradigm, and fix it in the technological paradigm as we develop smart machines and algorithms and smart technology that can get rid of a lot of the menial labor that humans have been doing for millennium, and give people free time to explore ideas and what makes them tick, and to flourish, and to get a sense of meaning and purpose that is more personal to them, and to use that for the betterment of their societies and for the betterment of the species and the betterment of everything, really. So this might sound dangerously utopian to some people, but we're already sort of living in a dystopian reality right now without realizing it. We've gone very very much in a disturbing direction, and we're trying to course correct from that. And if we don't do anything, then we're going to carry over this view of human beings as just a piece that can be moved around on a chessboard without any individual needs or personality or anything like that. We're going to carry that into the next paradigm, the technology paradigm, and we're going to regard human beings as just a small circuit or piece of code in a giant computer, rather than human beings having their own integrity and values and things to contribute. So we want to prevent that. So this is something to move forward with and give us a sense of meaning. Something that we can all get behind is, hey, clearly what's been what we've had for our entire lives hasn't been working, and it's led to all these terrible mental illnesses and all these other afflictions, physical illnesses, the way that we've industrialized agriculture and made uh, eliminated nutritious food. We've eliminated nutritious content for human consumption, or made it at least not incentivize people to seek it out. So I've posted recently about the fast food diet versus the slow food diet, and the fast media diet versus the slow media diet. The technological paradigm is going to force us, whether we like it or not, and I think it's empowering, to be more engaged with what we consume, what we put into our bodies, and what we put into our minds. Um, and to recognize that we went really far astray. It might have been one of the only options that we had at the time, but we went down a really dark road, and we can come out of that. So it's empowering. The next way of looking at history is through narratives, and we're narrative creatures. We view the world around us through our senses, and we gather sensory inputs and data, but we can't really do anything with it. It doesn't really mean anything by itself. The little bits of information that our eyes and ears and nose and tongue and fingers pick up, it we have to weave it together into a meaningful narrative. And as we've shifted between these various paradigms, um, we've become more reliant on bigger and bigger narratives to connect everything. And there's a good thing to narrative and a bad thing to narrative. The good is that it allows people to collaborate beyond just a small tribal unit. So if you want people to get together and to create and to innovate and to make new tools and build massive cities and the modern world, then you have to get people to believe in a common thing. So that's where narratives, more elaborate narratives, came in. At first, it was religious narratives. So it was a shift from spiritual kind of pagan beliefs to in beliefs in Mother Nature and things like that, to more formalized religions and institutions. And with each um, narrative comes an institution, and those institutions, unfortunately, so the narrative is more like the ideal, and the institution is the real world embodiment of the ideal, and those can easily become corrupted. People often confuse narratives um, with institutions, but it's like the the narrative of Christianity and of Christ is different from the Catholic Church covering up a pedophilia scandal. So that's a good way of looking at the separation between um, narratives and institutions, because narratives can be abused by institutions for purely the accumulation of power. And we have seen that in many, many different circumstances. Now, one thing that I forgot to mention that I should hop back to for a second is that each paradigm that exists has its own form of slavery. So with agriculture, there was chattel slavery, which was quite literally the owning of human beings, as we saw in the South and in other places in the world. And then with industry, there was factory slavery, which was, not as bad as chattel slavery per se, but it was low wages, unsafe working conditions, people having to work super, super long hours, having to regiment their lives. The whole concept of time, as we now know it, in obsession with watches and calendars and whatnot, a lot of it is traced back to having to standardize human beings' waking hours so that they could be sold for as inputs for involvement in the factory system or the industrial economy. Before that, people lived their lives on a different sense of time based on day and night and crop cycles and seasons and things like that. So the sense of time and the sense of progress really has really changed. Um, so there were the religious narratives that started to develop, and later on, other narratives started to develop, including national narratives. So America or the United Kingdom or Russia or any number of other kind of global superpowers, Germany, Japan, China, and we're still living with a mix of religious narratives today and national narratives. Another narrative that people often don't really think about is money, which is a shared fiction that we have. The fact that we believe that it has value is what allows us to exchange it and actually allows it to have value. And if you're more interested in some of these things, the historian Yuval Noah Harari actually talks about these things in his books Sapiens, Homo Deus, and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, which I highly recommend. They're very compelling. So, um, really, in mid the mid 19th century, you had this blow to religious narratives where Darwin came out with his book on the origin of species, where he talks about how human beings weren't really God's chosen creatures or God's children. They were just another branch of the evolutionary tree, another, albeit more highly sophisticated ape. And that really caused a lot, it really damaged a lot of people's beliefs, obviously, and their perception of religious narrative. And it was at a time where people were already disoriented because of the effects of industrialization, which was causing people to live atomized existences. So this blow to their belief system caused a lot of people to seek out something else as a narrative that allows people to connect together and get a sense of fulfillment and purpose in their lives. And what emerged were the humanist narratives. So if you think about the religious narratives as saying, hey, whatever position in life you're born into and you grow up in, it's yours to endure, whether it's good or bad. Ultimately, you're going to die and you're going to go to heaven, and there's this heavenly utopia that you'll live in, and it'll all be worth it. And what the humanist narratives were saying is, okay, now Darwin has kind of just knocked that narrative over, and there's people question whether heaven even exists, whether God exists, um, and the narrative in its place is, okay, well, we have science and reason and a bunch of progress that's been happening with the start of industrialization and since the Enlightenment, and we've been fixing a lot of things and coming up with cures for certain medical ailments and diseases, and we have devices now that make our labor more easy and makes organizing society more easy. What if we could organize society in a way that relied primarily on reason and technology and science to create an earthly utopia? So instead of waiting to die and we don't know what's going to happen, why don't we try to bring that to earth and improve our current conditions? So you had a lot of different and often very brutal experiments that resulted from these philosophies. And essentially, this was the birth of starting to regard, in a modern sense, starting to regard humans as pieces that you could manipulate and standardize, and a society that you could perfect through the right degree of social engineering. And the narratives that emerged were liberal humanism, socialist humanism, and the third one was, it is eluding me for a second, it was evolutionary humanism. And so liberal humanism was based off of the ideas of the Enlightenment and putting the individual first and self betterment, the pursuit of happiness, uh, being equal before the law. So it took the religious notion of being equal under the eyes of God and turned it into a secular notion of being equal under the law. But liberalism ultimately acknowledged that people are different, and you should kind of leave that as it is and allow people to flourish in their own ways with minimal intervention. And a lot of this was built into the founding documents of the United States by the founding fathers. And a lot of these ideas became sort of Western norms, norms of Western style democracies, I guess you could say. And it was new at the time because this is a bit of a diversion, but originally we all came out of Africa. And then there was a lot of the African um, societies remained rather tribal, and the Asian societies became more authoritarian, and the European societies became more, I guess you could say, liberty based or libertarian or liberal. So it was more of an emphasis on like an open society. And this is where people make arguments about, like, genetics and racial supremacy and the differences between groups. And what a lot of people miss is that something as simple as geographic features can drastically change the arcs of given societies and cultures and groups and the way that people behave. So generally every group of people has a vast range of intelligence within its domain. So you have really smart people, really not very smart people, and those tend to be approximately similar between groups. But if a group is stuck in a situation like where they're where they're in a desert, or there aren't as many resources, or maybe they're divided by a mountain range from another group, and one group, a natural disaster forces one group in one direction, one group in another, it completely changes how the different societies develop and what they prioritize. And like in the case of European society, um, they were able to accumulate wealth both through exploitation and through investment in science and technology, and that allowed further investment in thinking and philosophy, and systems of education that encouraged the pursuit of narrative breaking thought that pushed progress in different ways, where other cultures remained more stagnant. So it's sort of an explanation as to how things have developed in the way that they have. And it's dismissive of sort of the notion that some people have of racial or national or ethnic supremacy slash inferiority. So that was just a side note. But these different humanist narratives were the ones that took over after the religious narratives I just before described, liberal humanism. And the second narrative is um, socialist humanism. And socialist humanism said that there are these differences among people, but they exist because of exploitation of the powerful of the weak. And so whether it's along racial lines or gender lines or class lines or national lines or whatever, it's people who have resources, and whether those resources are material or whether it's power, using those resources to exploit the the people that don't have those resources. And if you can only reappropriate those, I shouldn't say reappropriate, redistribute those material and immaterial resources, then you will have a just society where everybody is effectively equal in opportunity and able to flourish in their own ways. So that was the philosophy that was adopted by Marxism and by the Soviet Union, and to some extent by China, if you consider, because China is kind of a hybrid system, not really fully communist, although it has the Communist Party, in as well as other communist countries that developed. So the third narrative, which was evolutionary humanism, is really what ultimately became fascism, and in an even more extreme case, Nazism. And this belief system was basically like, there are differences between people and groups, and these differences are inborn, they're genetically based, and it doesn't really matter how much social engineering that you're going to do. These differences are always going to exist. There are always going to be makers and takers, people who are superior, people who are inferior. They're going to be people who are naturally better at things, people who are naturally worse at things, and society should be designed to basically shuttle resources to the people who have more going for them, and kind of choke off or eliminate or outright annihilate the the people or the groups that are seen as less desirable. So it was eugenic in its nature, and it was trying to manipulate the fitness of the group. So it was basically, you'll notice that a lot of these ideologies, that I think I had mentioned this before, are obsessed with like science and in taking the realm of science and trying to apply it to human beings. And the obsession of evolutionary humanism was trying to take Darwinism and apply it to the human realm. So that's what people really have a difficult time defining fascism. Fascism at its root is saying that humanity and nations exist within a state of struggle, just like the state of nature, the animal kingdom, and that it is the job of the nation to, or the state, to make each nation to make the nation as strong as in uniform as possible to survive the struggle, basically. So everybody should fall in line to make the state or the nation one functioning organism that is way more effective than everybody kind of going about seeking their own purpose or their own meaning. And so it was more of a standardization, and that's typical fascism. And Nazism took it a step further by saying instead of nationality, it's race. So that was the third narrative, evolutionary humanism, and that happened to be the first one to really get struck down after World War II, when the world saw the results of the concentration camps and saw all of the brutality of Nazism and fascism. It was dealt a serious blow, and that left two narratives remaining. The next one to be struck down, and by the way, these aren't struck down entirely. There are obviously people that still believe in these things, but in general, it loses, these ideas lose much of their active support when they're discredited in this kind of way. So socialist humanism really got destroyed with the collapse of the Soviet Union back in the early 90s. And that left liberal humanism really as the only narrative that humanity had, the only non-religious narrative. And the Americans had, for the last 60 years, built a world order around being the primary superpower combating the other world pole, which was the Soviet Union and communism. And to all of a sudden be the only one on the scene was kind of interesting, because you define yourself largely based on what you oppose, or your enemy or the villain. That's a narrative, the very simplest narrative that we tend to have. And for your villain to all of a sudden leave the scene, what do you do? You have to find something else. So that largely explains how the United States, with this giant military infrastructure that it had carried on through the end of World War II, when it built it up and used the war economy to get out of the Depression, and had to maintain this to fight the Soviet Union and build it up even further and use brinksmanship. It now needed to find new places to use this technology, and so or this military power. So effectively, liberal humanism turned into neoliberalism and neoconservatism. And neoliberalism is the idea that markets are sort of the god force, where markets will solve everything and bring people together. And then neoconservatism was the idea of the United States should go around the world projecting its power and trying to rebuild the world and its image and trying to nation build and go to places like Iraq and Libya and use its military power sort of to like intimidate the bad guys into doing the into following American values, right? And both of these were my opinion, I'm obviously biased, misguided principles, but they were the result of not really course correcting or thinking about what the new narrative should be or what new route should be followed. It was just sort of okay, go, because it's almost like in those old Looney Tune cartoons where Wile Coyote runs off the end of the cliff and he's just running on thin air and there's nothing beneath him. That's kind of the situation that the United States was in, where there was no runway, there was no plan, or nobody had really decided before what to do in the situation that the major enemy was no longer on the scene. So you end up with pursuing smaller enemies, like taking the massive Cold War military industrial complex and using it to combat terrorism. And you have uh, endless wars and occupations and things like that, as well as the United States trying to basically create these alliances to create markets everywhere and to allow market access and maintain this American-led global order. And there's not really a clear path or unifying principle behind it. And that's where we are right now. Is a lot of this is falling apart, and it's extremely distressing to people because nobody really understands what's going on. The people who have lived their entire lives, it's like the foundation between their feet is falling out from them. The people who are younger are starting to say like, okay, what's going on here? uh you know, we get a lot of our impressions of the world through what our parents tell us, and basically through what we've seen over our lifespans. And this has only existed really for like 70 years in total since the end of World War II, 75 years since the end of World War II, but also really like 25, 30 years for the kind of young adults that are out there right now. And it's resulting in high rates of anxiety and depression. And it's because this last narrative of liberal humanism is collapsing, and it's proving not really to work in the context of the modern world, where technology is entirely shifting perspectives and throwing everything in the blender. And we need a new narrative because we the old narrative is like childhood clothes that don't fit anymore. It's like this narrative is restraining us, and it's like reality is going to continue to not make any sense because we don't have anything to jump onto. It's like we're all clinging to the debris of a shipwreck, and we're not going to let go of that debris until there's another ship that's nearby that we can get on board. So that's where I suggest that technological humanism is the next narrative that is going to take the best elements of liberal humanism and onboard them, and basically say, okay, everybody, we have a common goal and an individual ability to seek your fulfillment and contribute to that common goal. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. The future is both libertarian and socialist at the same time, if that makes sense. It's a paradox because um, you want to promote individualism and self-actualization and creativity and uh, what's the word, innovation, but you also want to promote sort of pro-social values and empathy, and you want a society to continue to exist rather than just a mad anarchic power grab. So that's what I put forward. That's the narrative view of history. And I should go back and mention various ego blows that have happened throughout history. So the first ego blow was when Copernicus revealed that the sun did not revolve around the earth. The earth was not the center of the universe. It was actually the earth that revolved around the sun. That really was a shock to the collective human consciousness, because previously we thought that we were the center of everything. The second ego blow that occurred, as I mentioned before, was Darwin revealing that we weren't actually God's chosen children in the Garden of Eden. We were another species of sophisticated ape. Um, that really destroyed the perception of human beings as the chosen ones. And by the way, these national narratives continue to exist today of different people. You see the vestiges of them, like American, like kind of America first. Americans are the chosen ones, or Israelis are the chosen people, or Russians or the Chinese, or anyway. You still see these fictions that are like, hey, we're the chosen people and we can do whatever we want. So the latest ego blow that we're actually going through right now, you're going to see this alignment kind of all of these different things, like a new paradigm, a new narrative, a new ego blow. All these things are happening right now, which is why you see such just mind-blowing confusion and high rates of anxiety, and people just not knowing what to do, not knowing what to settle on, the feeling that the foundation is gone. So this latest ego blow is how in the Enlightenment, there was this idea that human beings alone, through their reason, had the capacity to understand everything, and through knowledge could understand the infinite universe. We're now realizing that the universe is so complex, and not only complex, but hyper complex, because complexity builds on complexity. Like the human mind is super complex, the economy is super complex, the environment and ecosystems are super complex, but they're not just individually complex. It's like they're systems of complexity linked to other systems of complexity in a hyper complex kind of matrix of complexity. And there's so many variables, and our simple cause and effect view of things isn't actually going to cut it. We're, regardless of how much we figure out or how much we know, we're only going to understand a grain of sand in the whole scheme of things, and even that's going to be like largely temporary, in that like um science isn't an end state, it's a process, and you figure out more things and unearth things, or you dethrone previous beliefs. And that's how paradigm shifts happen in the scientific world, is you and there's a saying that science progresses one death at a time. Is you get people who are so wedded to what they've studied or the belief system that they exist under, that you basically have to wait for people to be less orthodox and devout to move into the next thing. So that's how it can take generations for this progress to occur. Um, but this is a big ego blow, because what we're realizing is that really it's going to be our creations and our symbiosis with our creations, like human integration with technology, that is going to allow a better understanding of the world. So, um, if we encode artificial intelligence and algorithms that can understand the correlations between all of these different variables, we're not even necessarily going to understand the output that it spits out, because it's in machine learning. So it's just going to, like, it might produce a solution that's far more incredible than anything humans could produce, but it's not going to necessarily be anything that we understand, because we encode information differently, we think in certain structured ways, and we verbalize things. So we sort of like our wetware computers in our heads do very specific things that our creations and our technology aren't going to be limited by. So the good news is that each of these ego blows that's occurred, you can move beyond them. Like it's going to shock a lot of people, and create a lot of uncertainty with people, but society continues to move along. And I think that the best approach to have is a sense of awe and a sense of openness, because the future is going to be very weird and unpredictable in a lot of ways. Some amount of it we can kind of plan around, but we need to create a system that's more modular and accommodating rather than just rigidly institution based. It needs to be more networked, I guess I would say, because if it's super rigid with deep roots, then you know as technology continues to advance, it's just going to crack apart those institutions more and more frequently, and it's going to create just unnecessary chaos all the time. Okay. So I've done paradigms, I've done narratives, done ego blows. The next one that I want to talk about is saeculums and generations. So this is the idea that basically progress occurs through cycles, and those cycles are composed of generations. So a generation is about 20 years, and 4 generations is about the length of a human lifespan. And in this context, that's referred to as a saeculum. There's a phenomenal, very understandable book about this called The Fourth Turning. And this sounds like I'm talking about astrology or something, but it's actually uh, it's pretty compelling. It's a theory, and it's basically that um, you have cycles of these 80 to 100-year cycles called saeculums, composed of 4 generations each, where uh, each phase of the cycle, each generation has a different event occurring. So, or um, a different nature to it. So there's a crisis, a high, an awakening, and an unraveling. So the crisis is when everything falls apart, like the previous narrative falls apart, or the previous way of doing things completely is at its lowest, and society's at its most divided. And then the next phase that generally takes about 20 years. The next phase is the high, which is society after the crisis, and the catharsis of the crisis comes together again, starts to become civically united and aims towards a common goal, and starts to accomplish a bunch of things, and set its sights on new things. And there's wealth and creation and excitement, and people feeling like there's actually progress and opportunity and all these things. And then there's eventually an awakening where people say, okay, this is kind of stagnant, and this is starting to be a bit too oppressive in certain ways. And an example of that is like the from the baby boom high in the 50s and early 60s to the counterculture revolutions in the 60s and 70s, with the youth movements being like, yeah, all this suburbia is getting really spiritually deadening, and it would be nice to rebel against it. So that's generally what an awakening is. And then there's an unraveling, which is things start to further disintegrate, setting the stage for the crisis. And so that's interesting. There have been every 80 to 100 years major crises, which have often involved total wars. But going back to, let's see, there was the War of the Roses, the Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution. Oh, the War of the Roses, the Armada Crisis, the Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Great Depression, and World War II. And now, what this book argues is we're going through the next cycle of the crisis, where we're going to come out of a crisis and be in a period of high. But the last one, the last saeculum, which is the length of the human lifespan, remember, is the lifespan of basically the boomer generation. They were born right after a huge crisis. The values that were imparted to them were out of that crisis mindset, where their parents had to live through a depression and fight a global war on the international front with soldiers dying, and on the home front with sacrifice and contributing to the war effort. And and the boomers grew up at a time where society was putting itself together, and there were all these opportunities, and education was more cheap, and jobs were more prevalent, and home ownership was more possible, and the government policy towards investment and inflation was making it more easy to pay off mortgages, and generally people stayed with the same company, jobs had pension plans and all these things. So this isn't me discrediting, I'm not saying that boomers didn't work hard, but they grew up in a very different environment that was like phenomenally unique in the history of the world to that moment. And it has like the millennial generation grew up in the came of age, or was born into an unraveling and came of age in a crisis, so they have a completely different mindset where like the stability never really aside from the stability that boomers had accumulated, the stability didn't exist for nearly as many people in the millennial generation. And Gen Z is born in the midst of the crisis, and they're coming of age in the post-crisis high. So the interesting thing is that depending on which stage of the saeculum you're born, you actually take on a character or an archetype that kind of plays out and gives your generation a certain character or worldview or mindset. So if you're born during a high like the boomers were, the archetype that the authors use in the book is a prophet archetype, and that means that's prophet, not profit. And the archetype of the people born during an awakening, like Generation X, was a nomad archetype, which means that you're more independent and you have to make your own way. So you think about like higher rates of abortion and higher divorce rates and latchkey kids, and more economic insecurity emerging, and that those are sort of like Gen X becoming more independent and more suspicious of institutions and authority and things like that in the Watergate era. And then you have um, people born during an unraveling like the millennials, and they generally become a hero generation. And this isn't like me tooting my own horn because I'm a millennial, or me being overly um, optimistic about the millennial generation, but it's generally what happens is if you're born with things mostly falling apart and people at their most individualized and broken away from trust in institutions and an emergent crisis, and people doubting you, and all these things blended together, uh, it's likely that the generational character of the millennials is going to overlap with the generational character of the greatest generation, who was born into the interwar years after World War One, when society was super rattled and trying to figure itself out again, and you had kind of like the lost generation. Um, so nobody really thought much of the greatest generation before they fought in World War II and the Great Depression. And the millennial generation is finding themselves in that same situation where fate is kind of tapping us on the shoulders, and nobody else is going to solve these problems. So we're going to have to kind of do cleanup with a lot of this stuff, and figure a lot of these things out and integrate technology. And only in integrating the ideas and the technologies and the newness of the cycle that has started since the previous crisis do you bring about the new high, the new period of hope and coming together on the other side of the current crisis. So um, there needs to be know-how, and there needs to be morale, and there needs to be the right attitude and the right leadership that all kind of come together and converge. And it allows it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where people start to say, well, you know what, this is better than any other option that I've seen out there, and I actually think this could succeed. And they start to like there's this trickle effect of more people contributing their effort, and more people contributing their effort and saying, oh, I think this might actually work, I think this might actually work. And then it happens. So I'm super excited about this. I truly believe in this, and I think it's going to happen. So now you know generations and turnings and saeculum. So the next one is supercycles. And with supercycles, it's like imagine what I was just talking about was general cycles. Supercycles is something that Ray Dalio talks about. He's an economist, I believe, and it's like if wars happened in a predictable cycle, if economic crashes happened in a generally predictable cycle, if um, any birth rates happen in a somewhat predictable cycle. So like as we start to become aware of these patterns, our awareness of them causes us to behave in certain ways because we start to plan for them. And then when we plan for them, they become two things can happen. They can become more set and more standardized, or they can move away from our planning. So how do I put it? So there's something called a first order chaotic system and a second order chaotic system. The first order chaotic system is like the weather. So our knowledge of all the variables that go into weather and how they interact with each other doesn't change how weather behaves. But a second order chaotic system is like the economy, where if we start to piece together all the variables that cause the economy to behave in a certain way, our knowledge of how the economy works is going to cause people to behave in a different way, and then the economy is going to sort of like move away and have a counter response to that behavior. So that could happen with some of these cycles that I'm talking about. But generally, the awareness of these cycles over time is going to cause a lot of them to converge, and people's planning for events like wars or a financial crisis is going to become self-fulfilling prophecy that increases the effect of or causes that thing to happen, which is pretty wild when you think about it. So um, over time and over the course of the entire planet, as economic systems and different nationalities become more integrated with each other, these cycles can all sort of converge onto one massive cycle, and that's a super cycle. And to make it more complex, there are like cycles embedded within cycles. So I guess the way to think about that, the way that I visualize it, is if you think about the waves of the ocean as a cycle, then the ripples on the surface of the water would be a smaller cycle within that cycle, and the tides would be a higher level cycle above the waves. So it's like like a massive cycle composed of smaller ripples within the cycle, and then even smaller ripples on the surface of those ripples. And so maybe you have economic crashes that happen every 10 years, and then you have um, saeculums that occur over 80 to 100 years, and then you have paradigms that happen over 1,000 years or something like that, and each of these things is embedded over the larger version. So it's you have to understand kind of the mathematical concept called fractals, which is something that's self-similar. So as you zoom out, it starts to look like the smaller version of itself, and if you zoom in, the same thing happens. So it's almost like if you were to zoom into a human being, which is like, we're an organized whole, you would find organ systems and then organs and then tissues and then cells. And then you go further into cells, you find organelles and atoms and quarks and whatever. And then like if you zoom out of the human, then you have uh, various social systems and like I don't know, a family, a community, a state, a nation, a planet, and then you move out and you have a planetary system. And so that's kind of what fractal is like in a way. So that's super cycles. The last thing is alliances, and this is a weirder one. It's kind of like less predictable and more based on sort of what's practical at the time. But you see this play out throughout history where there are unlikely alliances. So one of the examples that I can think of in the 20th century has many examples, but So the United States allied with the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis. And then once the Nazis were defeated, the Soviet Union became the primary enemy because it was the United States and the Soviet Unions that were kind of like the last ones standing. And so then the United States used former Nazis, brought them over into our uh, rocket programs and into NASA, and used those former Nazis to help defeat the Soviets. Not only did the United States use former Nazis, it also recruited Mao Zedong, who was the leader of communist China at the time, and also paired up with and stoked Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East to help defeat the Soviet Union. Eventually, all these forces would become stronger and become greater threats to the United States sense of identity. So now you have a stronger China today, you have stronger Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East. So they became uh, future headaches. Short term, it was beneficial and expedient, and then they became future headaches. And you see that happening on the global scale, but you also see it happening with domestic politics, where you have these coalitions within the Democratic and Republican parties who pair with unsavory characters in the short term to defeat the opposition in the short term, and then it becomes a headache in the longer term. So whether it's the left and communists or the right and fascists slash Nazis, you have that happening. You have the unsavory histories of the political movement. So the conservative history of support for the segregation movement and anti-civil rights movement before the Southern strategy and the switch from the Dixiecrats to the Republican Party. Um, you had the progressive history of aligning with eugenicists and really kind of unsavory views and gross pseudoscientific social application views of different policies. Um, these got kind of like worked into the coalitions and mixed together and switched around and reshuffled and yeah, there's a lot of interesting trade-offs that are made in the short term, and you're definitely seeing this play out now with the recent election, where a lot of people who were really fed up said, "All right, well, we don't like either options, but we're going to vote for like Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or whatever because it's going to like although." That's not our preferred option. We're going to select it because it's more likely that we're going to defeat the greater enemy if we select that. But then you have people convincing themselves that just because they like this is a human tendency to do this is we want to think that we were given a good deal. So even if we chose something that we recognize was simply the better of two evils, we then convince ourselves, we go through great lengths to convince ourselves that what the option that we chose is actually phenomenal. So it's like, from once again, this is opinion, but whether somebody today is arguing in favor of Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or whatever, um, you can argue that they're better than the alternative, but in my opinion, you can't argue that they're a good option. So it's like you can argue that it was justifiable to team up with the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis, but you can't argue that Stalin was a good guy. Like you can't argue that wasn't a seriously terrible choice, terrible option. Same thing with pairing up with the Nazis to fight the Soviets or Mao or any of these like monstrously cruel world leaders or ideas to defeat something later down the line. So there's so much complexity here. Um, and then on top of all this, you also have uh, the notion of you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the enemy, which was a line from The Dark Knight. Harvey Dent said that. And so an example of this is the Americans who started by fighting the British and the idea of self-rule and the idea of individualism and liberal democracy and all these things, and then ultimately becoming this global superpower that's imposing itself on other countries, other smaller and weaker countries. It ultimately became the hegemon that it fought against in the beginning. So it took the place of the British Empire eventually down the line. You see the same thing with Jews, with Israel, where in Nazi Germany, they were in throughout history, they have been scapegoated, they have been pushed to the sides, they have been annihilated and horribly mistreated. And then today, the state of Israel basically is an apartheid state where they keep the Palestinians in a walled off area. So yeah, man, there is a lot of complexity to the world, and I guess that my ultimate request is that you keep your mind open to the fullness of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that you keep the conversation going, keep talking with others, sharing ideas. And we're moving into this period where we're going to start to be able to implement some phenomenal new ideas and have a much greater understanding of the world. So let's start understanding in more depth the problems that exist so that we can actually fix the solution or create the solution, because things are coming into alignment in a very particular manner. And if we're caught flat footed without having thought about this, then we will have squandered a lot of opportunity. So I hope you're as excited as I am. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it's necessary.